So starting with the first, which is the investment side. You know Alvin's background, so this is his day job.
Thanks, Prof.
Okay. So I have some questions already posted from Susan. The first of those is, how will COVID-19 affect the investment of startups?
I guess I can look at it in three ways. I think from valuations point of view, I think the current investors of a given startup, most of them are not very keen to do down rounds if there's an absolute requirement to go down that pathway. At the same time, also gone are the days of very high valuations of certain startups and whatnot. So I think those startups who have priced themselves at a pretty high premium for the past few years, I think, and if they are and this is the season where they start receiving or start to look for more funding in itself, I think they might see a bit of challenge in that sense. Then I guess the other aspect that would be affecting startups' investments would be traction. So I guess most of us are now sheltering at home, staying at home, helping to flatten the curve in itself. So I guess, I mean, and depending on which part of the world that we're in, I think in Singapore right now, we are most likely expected to be sheltering at home, staying at home for at least till June in itself. So I guess traction would be affected in some sense, especially for some startups that are involved in hardware development or involved in medtech development in itself. Then the last aspect that I think COVID-19 is playing a part in the startup investment scene would be runway in itself. So I think it is nice if you're running a startup right now and you are you have a few employees around you, I think it's nice to keep them around. It's great to keep them around, I think, also from an ethical point of view, but also at the same time, when the cash subsidy grants from the Singapore government runs out in itself, then I guess the other part is about looking at how much your runway can be extended, because I think with that circuit breaker measure or the MCO in Malaysia or whatever measure that's being put in around the world, I guess the runway would be, I mean, cash for expenses, for manpower expenses, would be a sizable part of a startup's budget in itself. Yeah.
So maybe if I could put a bit of a global perspective on Alvin. So if you look at the data from the beginning of December last year to the beginning of March this year, there's been a 70% reduction in the investment in startups from VCs around the world. That's a huge drop. The first drop, of course, was China, as you might imagine, and that has suffered the biggest drop. But interestingly enough, Europe's VC investments have remained despite at the same level, despite all this time. So in terms of what's going to happen here in Singapore, do you think because China was the first to drop, you think it'll recover very much more quickly? And when do you think that will recover?
I guess for whether we're going to see a similar trend or not in Singapore, I think there is a potential. I mean, it is possible to see that happening right now. And I guess we can look at it from both perspectives. I think from the VC's point of view, for example, if some of us are out there raising funds in itself, then that closing of the fund and then being able to deploy those funds for investments might become a challenge in itself, especially with the global public markets crash in itself. With regards to when could we see that recover? I would foresee that maybe by August, September, just putting out an arbitrary time point where I think this could be somewhere where we could see a form of recovery back to some form of normalcy. That's just probably my viewpoint in itself. But I guess from our parent company in South Korea at the moment, we're still very much business as usual. I mean, we're still out there looking for investments. We're still out there looking for deals, but we're also at the same time monitoring some of our portfolio startups in a sense where we're looking at making sure that they have enough runway to last till the end of this year, for example, and positioning them in for a better funding situation, maybe from 2021 onwards. Yeah.
Okay, so that neatly comes to the next question, which is, Is it still possible to raise money from VCs? And particularly if you say you have the sufficient monies at the moment, what are you looking for?
So yes, I think the answer would be, I think it's still possible to raise money from VCs from this environment, and I'm happy to do a shout out to one of our recent portfolio startups, How Foods, where it's a food tech space in itself, whereby we were able to we closed the deal close to February, March in itself. That was before I think the whole sheltering in place measures are being slowly put in place around the world in itself. But I think in this current environment, I think two major factors still comes into play. Maybe in terms of traction, for example, I would like to see startups come up with a few presumptions. For example, if you're still working from home, and this working from home arrangement might drag on beyond June, July, August. How are you still going to maintain that traction in itself? Also, at the same time, if you're looking at startups who are mainly developing medtech devices or developing hardware devices, and you are not able to be in the laboratories, to be in the workshops itself, and they're on a standstill, how are you still maintaining those traction, the product development efforts in itself? Then I guess the other part that as part of this COVID in assessing for startups from an investment point of view is runway. So how we look at, and with the presumption again, with if work from home is still being extended, to help flatten the curve or to help avoid the second wave of infections and whatnot, then how are these companies planning to use the fresh funds of injections, or to use their current pool of funds to maintain, to keep their staff, or some of them could be positioning themselves in a better state itself to hire more and to build out more while everybody else is barely surviving in itself. Yeah.
Okay, so does it help? Because it seems to help, at least in my space. We have two big US VCs have raised well over $1 billion for their funds announced in the last week or so. But both sets of VCs actually admit quite freely they put coronavirus quite freely in their fundraising from LPs. So this has helped them get the money. Does having coronavirus somewhere in your application as a startup help, do you think?
I think it helps to a certain way. I guess then again, for example, maybe if I just use a local startup here in Singapore, Outside, for example, where it's almost similar to TaskRabbit, where where it could be a healthy individual going down to pick up lunch for themselves, but they can pick up lunch for the rest of the neighborhood, and they get paid out in itself. They are actually benefiting from the coronavirus situation in itself. And I could see that, in the medtech space, we saw biolytics coming up with antibody test kits and or diagnostic kits in itself, and they are benefiting from the coronavirus itself. But having said that, I think there are certain startups that are not the direct beneficiaries, but I guess the current opportunity right now would be that how can you make the best out of it? For example, if workers are being placed at home, are we looking at potentially remote robotic types of solutions, while manufacturing could still continue, in some form of normalcy in that case in itself. So short answer, yes, I think adding the coronavirus helps, but also explaining how the startup or how the given company can make the best out of the situation itself. That would be helpful to investors as they evaluate the startup.
I think so.
Along the way. Yeah.
For one startup I've been helping, just as a stop aside, is that which is in the F&B space. So they are creating a new, what we call rheologically defined food. We are now talking about COVID-19 food stuff, because you want easy to store, easy to eat, as well as nutritionally good to boost your immune system. So we are using those buzzwords shamelessly, unfortunately.
That's all right. I think that could be of interest. Yeah, that's great.
It is being used. Okay, so the next question, you sort of half answer this, is what new investment approach are VCs taking in light of the current crisis to turn challenges into opportunities?
I guess, for investment approaches from VCs or for early stage startup investments, I think has always been revolving around value adding and sourcing better in itself. So I think for value adding, our company in South Korea and also in our Singapore branch, we have recently onboarded more folks who are just solely looking at portfolio management, whether it could be, but I think some VCs and probably some like ourselves, we are also in the same area of value adding to our portfolio startups where we do have, I think, for example, a dedicated group of individuals with special skill sets, such that whether we are looking at helping the startup plan their go-to-market strategy better, whether we have startups or whether we have personnel who have warm relationships with large leading corporates in Singapore, in South Korea, or in other parts of the world in itself, to open the doors when our startups ask for them to do so, to help them do so, or even just looking just at that pitch deck and how to structure it better such that the storytelling approach is a lot more improved in a sense. More value. I want to emphasize that a bit more, a bit of while things are coming to somewhat a standstill, but I think the standstill is about to finish. How can we make best of it, better of it? I think the second approach is about sourcing better. So I think a lot of us are stuck at home, but we also want to make the best of what we can do at home itself. So I think and being at home, there's more time, we can squeeze in more meetups, but I think also there's also a part where I think for VCs, for investors, for mentors itself, we are definitely also using this opportunity in a ready position to invest, but sometimes I'm more than happy to give back our time in itself. Just a special shout out to Gratitude. I think Gratitude VC was being formed, as a group in itself, was formed by a group of mentors, a group of folks who are in investments in itself. I think that was started by Elise Tan, who was previously from EF in itself, and I'm a grateful member as part of the group in itself, and we are able to I've been speaking to more startups. Some of them are not directly in my direct area of usual interest, but happy to speak to them, give them some points of view, probably point them in the right direction, and link them up with certain folks that might accelerate the startup's development in itself. So is that helping to source better? Maybe, but I think also at the same time, we also want to give back to the innovation community itself, and to see how we can better position our startups, better position our innovators in Singapore when the recovery takes place, when the market recovery comes into place in itself. Yeah.
Okay, so the number of virtual investor fora has trebled apparently in the last quarter. So more and more investors are now using virtual conference fora to see pitches and the like. In fact, I was involved with one at the beginning of the year in Hong Kong. Are you using this format to get pitches to you?
I guess yes and no. So yes, in a sense, we are part of, I think KK Fund has recently done connecting with startups and investors in itself. So we are part of it for a few regions where we have indicated an interest as well. My company will be shortly opening up our own virtual office hours in itself. Having said that, we are not a substantial, or we are not a very well-known player in itself, but we want to value add in whatever ways we can. But at the same time, some of the startups may not be ready for investments, but we're more than happy to start the conversation early, such that when we are in the position to invest in a given startup, when the circumstances are right, then I think that can shorten the whole assessment process in itself. Yeah.
Okay, all right, so we need to move on to the next session, but I just want to make one last comment.
Please.
Alvin is one of the good guys, I think, in this space. But I think for all those of you listening out there, beware of the vulture capitalist. The VC that actually comes to pick off the bones of you struggling. And unfortunately, this is the time the vulture capitalists come out.